Okay, so tonight we're starting the imperialism. There's going to be two different major phases of it. European imperialism was a powerful thing, had already been a powerful thing, obviously. We've been doing this the whole semester. The Europeans are getting on boats ever since the 1500s and going off and conquering foreign lands. So imperialism is not a new thing for the Europeans, and it's not a new thing for a lot of places that they will try to conquer. It's been going on for a long time. You'll often see this referred to as the new imperialism in textbooks once you get into the late 1800s in books or movies or documentaries or whatever you're talking about. Imperialism was not new to the Europeans. They've been doing it for a long, long time. 3 centuries, give or take, starting with Spain way back when we started the semester. So this is not a new experience. So why do they call it the new imperialism? Largely because the Europeans had not expanded their imperial areas for a long time by the 1870s, 1880s. They hadn't expanded very much in areas they had conquered since the very early 1800s at best, more like usually the late 1700s. So they had imperialism, conquering new places, had gone out of European politics for almost a century, as the Europeans really got more interested in revolutions and then Napoleon and then more revolutions and all the stuff we talked about the last couple of weeks. What causes the new imperialism? That's an interesting question, and something that historians have taken a long time and a lot of energy and filled up a lot of books discussing. Why did it break out again in the 1870s? There are several different reasons: social, cultural, economic, and even military. One of the major ones that is identified is the idea of social Darwinism. Charles Darwin put out his theories of evolution in 1859, and other scientific types of thinkers, notably Herbert Spencer, took those ideas and applied them to human societies. And that's where you get the idea of social Darwinism. We talked about that already, right? Okay. Spencer tried to use it in individual human societies like cities or countries or something like that. Other theorists, foreign policy theorists, try to spread it out even further to the kind of warfare amongst different human races and the survival of the fittest race in society, in human society on the globe. Europeans became very obsessed with that. And obviously Europeans decide that they are the height of the human ladder, that they are the best around, and that eventually breaks down into who's the best European race. So this is where you get a lot of Germans saying that the Germans are the best, and the French saying the French are best, and the British, and on and on and on. And they all want to be the best. And they all want to guard their power. So a lot of European foreign policy thinkers and economic thinkers start saying that the only way, for instance, the British nation, the British race, can survive in a hostile world of even other European races, say the Germans and the Swedes and the French and the Italians. The only way for your nation to survive is to gain valuable lands, strategic lands, militarily or economically, that could bring wealth or power into your country. And if your country gains that access to wealth and power, your country becomes wealthier and more powerful and can defend itself against these other, even European races that are kind of encroaching on your power throughout time. So this becomes kind of thought of as the international survival of the fittest race. So that's one way that this thing gets going again. And of course the Europeans that are thinking in this way start looking for valuable land to conquer, to expand their territories. Not just to gain wealth and access to wealth, good resource bases and big markets and things like that, but to deny it to their enemies. Power is what is often called a zero-sum game. Have you guys ever heard that terminology? You often hear it in international politics and whatnot. Zero-sum game means that whenever somebody wins at something, somebody else loses. Say if I don't know, if me and you
Sports.
Yeah, not just sports. Say there's two people in this room, me and hopefully someone who's slower. And a $100 bill is somehow found on the ground. I grab it because I'm faster. That's plus 100 for me, right? But what is that for you? Minus 100. So they balance out. They equal 0. Does that make sense? That's what it means, a zero-sum game. No matter what the result is, it always evens out to 0 because one person wins, the other loses. Does that make sense? Or within a whole bunch of different societies, you can start dividing up the results all kinds of different ways. It gets somewhat confusing. So the Europeans start thinking that it's not only worthwhile for our country to go off and conquer, say, some place in Africa to get resources for ourselves, but we also systematically deny the Germans or the French or the Italians or whoever those same resources. So they lose in the game, even though they haven't really done much. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So this becomes also a paranoid system of power, right? Because you're not only interested in gaining for yourself, but you're interested in not losing. Does that make sense? Okay. That idea in politics has been very heavily criticized over time because it tends to lead to wars. But we won't get into it too deeply. Another thing that had risen up in Europe, especially, was the idea of nationalism, and especially after about the Napoleonic experiences, the experience with Napoleon conquering further and further. Napoleon's movement had released a lot of nationalism throughout Europe, especially in Germany. A lot of national sentiment that some peoples deserve to rise up and be great. And of course, every culture thinks it's great, so every culture wants to kind of rise up in this kind of power competition. And a lot of these rising nations, say Italy or Germany, like to define their greatness according to their national strength. Now, how do you do that? They look for different ways to prove that they are strong as a nation. And one of the ways that many of these different national leaders talked about proving it to the rest of the world was to bring their civilization, their culture, their society, their economic developments, their technology to the so-called backward peoples of the planet. And they honestly start looking to people who look different and talk different. So that was one excuse, another excuse that the Europeans used to go into places that they hadn't really outright conquered completely yet. So that would be important for places like China, Japan, other parts of South Asia, or Southeast Asia also, and particularly Africa. A lot of the Europeans will say, we're not just going into these areas to take out wealth for ourselves, but we are giving them the benefits of superior culture, technological advances and whatnot, and taking them out of their nasty kind of animalistic type tribal lives, and we're going to give them houses and all these great Western religions and things, and we're going to lift up humanity. It's a very optimistic thing, but it often is a smokescreen for dominating peoples and taking their stuff. The third one is probably the most important, at least in my mind. Industrialization had hit at first Britain, as we already talked about, and generally grew throughout the European world, including the United States in the late 1800s. So it had spread through the Western world. And this allowed imperialism to function on a greater level, a more powerful level than it ever had before. One of the major problems of European imperialism in the 1700s is that a lot of foreign peoples don't want to be conquered. And if, say, you want to go in and control all of India, they have a gigantic population. And if you only have, six-shooter gun or a rifle, a musket that you have to load very slowly, it's very easy for those native peoples to rise up against you. Because even if you have an army there and they all have muskets, there's 30,000 troops there or so, they shoot 30,000 bullets into the crowd, that crowd can be millions. They can take those hits and keep coming at you and win a revolutionary type of war against an imperial power. That starts to end with industrialization, with the more mechanical weapons that start getting invented, the rapid reloading weapons, and eventually right up to the machine gun, to the point where European powers will be able to send in much smaller armies to control much larger populations because of the increased firepower. So the military advantage is astronomical. And in my mind, this is what pushes the new wave of imperialism more than anything else. These other things were largely excuses. This was the fundamental system that allowed them to do it. It's just the increased firepower. If you have 500 troops in a town and they have machine guns, and say the native army has 500,000 soldiers and they all have swords, who do you think is going to win? The Europeans mow down the enemy, and it becomes a mass slaughter when native peoples try to rise up throughout the world. So this becomes a very bloody and brutal history of conquest. And the Europeans start fighting against each other. There are small wars amongst European powers for dominance over very specified areas of the globe that we'll get into. The event that really seems to kick off a lot of European reemergence of European imperialism is when Germany is unified in 1871. Bismarck very quickly said, we're not interested in taking colonies. But the unification of Germany put a lot of fear into France and Britain and even Belgium. And those groups start saying, well, now Germany is much more powerful in Europe, so maybe we have to go to other parts of the world to increase our power to be able to resist Germany. So even though the Germans didn't get into imperialism quickly, and it takes them 15, 20 years or so, by Bismarck's own design, it pushes a feeling of other European powers feel they have to start doing this quickly in order to survive. And of course, when the first one runs out and starts taking colonies, that is the kind of gun at the starting line that tells everyone else they better hurry up or else they're going to lose in this game. And if you lose in the economic power game, your country may be invaded in a few decades, right? If Germany or Italy or whatever country gains a whole lot of colonies and you've been asleep at the wheel, and they get a lot more than you do, and they can increase their economies, they can tax their citizens more, they can build up larger armies, they may just attack your country and take you out eventually. So it's a kind of grand, somewhat paranoid theory of international politics. And all this stuff is going to lead directly to World War I. And especially the rivalry between Germany, France, and Britain. That's going to become the most problematic one for the European world, at least. Okay, questions about any of these so far? Pretty easy to understand? All right. That's good. This is what World War I will eventually look like. Very quickly, when Germany was formed in 1871, France became very worried. They started planning for defense against Germany very quickly and immediately started having talks with the Russian government at St. Petersburg, their capital is at St. Petersburg, about what to do about Germany, because the Russians were also afraid of Germany invading eastward. So France and Russia very quickly got together and started talking about an alliance, an anti-German alliance, to create the nightmare scenario for Germany that if war breaks out, say if Germany invades France, then Russia should attack from the east. And that would force Germany to split its army in half to fight in the east and the west at the same time. Does that make sense? When that happened, Germany became paranoid that they're going to get attacked, so they sign on the country to the south, Austria-Hungary, to be allies in a potential war. And Italy goes back and forth. They sign on with the Germans first, and they go back and forth. Even during World War I, the Italians switched sides in the middle of the war. But that's where the treaty system really gets going that eventually will fight World War I. Britain stays out of it for as long as they can. for a very long time, for decades. And the German policy is to get Britain on Germany's side, because Germany has the largest amount of industry and the biggest military in Europe. Britain has the second largest amount of industry in Europe, and by far the largest colony system, the largest empire. So the German leaders figuring, especially the 1890s, if they can pull Britain toward their side, and if Britain signs on to their side of this treaty system, that if a war breaks out against France and Russia, with Britain's help, Germany will be virtually unbeatable. So that's going to be their long-term policy, and they go through a lot of different attempts to try to get Britain on their side. One of their big attempts is going to try to push France to do things that make Britain angry so that Britain will join with Germany. So it's a merry-go-round. It's like a love triangle kind of. It gets really weird. They're not really weird, but predictable when you understand what their incentives are. Let's see. What else does Germany do? In the 1890s, Germany also starts rebuilding its navy. Bismarck was very much afraid of that because Bismarck said, if you rebuild the navy, that will be a great threat against Britain. That will anger them more than anything else, so you shouldn't do it. Once the king kicked Bismarck out, they start rebuilding the German navy, and that does make the British very worried because Britain is an island, so navy is the biggest threat to them, and before the airplanes start taking off. So that's what European politics start to look like in the late 1800s. Does that make sense? And that's very important to understand for not just tonight, but going to the next couple weeks or so. To start with the division of Africa, the new wave of imperialism going into Africa had not started for about 10 years after Germany's unification. And it really only kicks off when the King of Belgium pushed some exploration attempts into Central Africa, an area that the Europeans call Congo, tried to expand a very small Belgian colony in Central Africa, interior Africa. They started expanding it very quickly, and that seems to have been the signal to the rest of the Europeans that they have to join in also, or else the King of Belgium somehow will come to dominate the whole African continent. So very quickly after the Belgians start doing that in 1881, the British start going in, the French start going in, the Germans start talking about the Italians, the Russians. I mean, it gets pretty ridiculous fairly quickly. Within a few years, by 1884, a conference is held in Berlin to determine some kind of basic rules of colonization in Africa, at least. And the rule they decide on at this conference is that they're not going to operate the way kind of Christopher Columbus did, by just going out there and taking a flag and saying, I claim every piece of land that I see for the King of Spain. That's not going to work, because you're going to have Europeans running around with flags everywhere, and it's going to get pretty messy. So the European agreement is that if you're going to take a colony, you cannot just send one guy out there at the flag. You have to occupy that place. You have to have a European population there. You have to start building cities, and you have to start kind of modernizing the area to control it. So you have to actually occupy the place that you're claiming. So the Europeans agree on that, and then they start running into Africa as fast as they possibly can, making different claims, building railroads, building European-style towns, even in the heart, the interior of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. The problem for this is that the Europeans went in, and they had absolutely no respect for the cultural ties that different African groups, native groups, already had with each other, and what they decided was the old kind of territorial lines of their different cultures. The Europeans went in, and they're looking for the most valuable land and the most strategically valuable places to hold in order to defend what they thought was the best place to get. And they start building colonies that include different religious and tribal groups. And that becomes a huge problem because in the mid-1900s, after World War II, the European colony system breaks down because the Europeans basically destroy themselves. They can't afford to keep these colonies. So they start withdrawing in the mid-1900s, and a lot of these now former colonies become independent states, governments. And that becomes very problematic because now you have governments that are built out of the European drawn borders that include many different cultures, many different backgrounds, ethnicities, different African groups, native African groups, and they often kill each other in order to get power. Because sometimes in some of these countries you can have 50 or 60 different languages being spoken. So even if you have a democracy on which group is going to win the vote, they can maybe win, say, a presidential election or something with 19% of the vote. And that often doesn't give that political party enough power to actually rule the country. So often, tragically, they go forward and start trying to eliminate their enemies in order to keep power. So the European division of Africa in the late 1800s has huge ramifications against Africa all the way down to today. Because a lot of those leaders are fairly brutal, and they view people living in their own country as like internal enemies. Okay, so going forward, much of the rest of the first half tonight is going to be talking about Northern Africa and Southern Africa, and after the break we'll go to East Asia. So to start with Northern Africa, the British and French had decided that in order, the British have a large colony in India, and the French have a large colony fairly next door in Southeast Asia, what they call then Indochina, which is today places like Cambodia and Laos and whatnot, Vietnam. The British and French decided in the mid-1800s that they were tired of going all the way around the southern tip of Africa because that was a long trip, it cost a lot of money, it was very dangerous down there. And it would be much easier if they could dig a canal somewhere that would link the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean they could just cut through. They picked out a place in northeastern Egypt. And the British and French particularly gave a lot of money and directed their companies to build this canal. The Egyptian government was fairly independent. Egypt at that point was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, but the Egyptian kind of provincial governors were fairly independent by that point, so they were largely making decisions on their own. So they agreed to allow these British and French companies in to build the thing and spend the money to build it, at least loan the money to the Egyptians to pay for it. The canal opened in 1869 was a hugely valuable waterway. Not just economically, but militarily, because now the British and French can move their naval boats, their warships, very quickly over to South or Southeast Asia in case some kind of rebellion or something breaks out. So it's a hugely strategic waterway and remains so for right up till today. So much so that the British eventually decide they want to completely take control of it. They do financially in 1875, so just about 6 years or so after the canal opened. The Egyptians didn't like that very much. The British basically decide to, if the Egyptian government isn't going to accept this, to take out the Egyptian government and just make Egypt into a British colony, which they do. The British, with their vastly superior navy, the British have the biggest navy in the world without any question into World War II. So the British have a worldwide kind of naval force to guard their empire. And they decide that Suez is so important that they're just going to take out the entire Egyptian government. And they bombard the major port city of Alexandria in order to convince the Egyptian government to give up And it works. So the British take control of Egypt in 1882 and turned it into literally a British colony. And it will remain so for quite a while. And the Suez Canal, we can see up here, is way over here. Very northeastern kind of part of habitable Egypt. Is so hugely important that the British want to control the whole country. And the British figure in order to control the whole country, they can't just keep a giant British army in the country the whole time. Egypt has a large population spread out over a fairly large territory. The British decide that in order to control Egypt, they want to control the Nile River. Nile River flows northward. The highlands are down here. And it flows downhill toward the Mediterranean Sea. So the British goal in controlling Egypt is to control the river, because they figure if some kind of rebellion breaks out, we can build a bunch of dams along the river, and if we control the very kind of high ground where the river kind of flows down from, then we can just shut off the water, and the Egyptian people will starve. That's an easy way to control the population. So they say we have to control the whole river, and in order to do that, they're going to have to control the land around the river, and especially the land around the kind of cataract-type mountains. So they're going to start invading southward to control as much of the river as they possibly can get their hands on. That's going to run into problems because the French have a few colonies in Western Africa, or sub-Saharan kind of Western Africa down here, and their foreign policy is eventually, they also have a few colonies over here on the Indian Ocean side, is to draw up a line of colonies going west to east. France thinks that that will solidify their position in Africa and allow the French to become dominant. So you have a problem between the British and French, and that problem is going to grow. Because these two are going to intersect, and their militaries are going to collide. And who loves the idea, who drools at the idea that this is going to happen? Yeah, the German leaders. Because they want to provoke the British and French to fight each other in as brutal and unforgivable a war as possible, in order for the British to be convinced that they can't trust the French, so they go and join the Germans in the alliance system in Europe itself. Does that make sense? So the Germans will use this as kind of like a proxy war almost to get what the Germans want, the German high leadership. And at this point, by 1890, the new German king is in power, and he is really starting to run German foreign policy very closely with his advisors and starting to cut Bismarck out. Germany has some small colonies by 1890 in the Nile River vicinity. And the German leadership decided that that was an untenable position for Germany. They weren't going to be able to keep those lands in the middle of what looks like a British versus French war is going to emerge. So the German leaders decided to get Britain on their good side by just handing over those lands to Britain. It was a free gift. And it's literally called the Nile River Gift in a lot of textbooks. And their number two kind of policy is to try to push the British to keep going south, keep encouraging them, and try to get the French to try to hold on to their position, and especially in an area called Abyssinia, which is on the eastern part, on the Indian Ocean side of Africa. And Abyssinia was a tragedy in itself. The Italians had tried to turn it into a colony for Italy. There was a native Abyssinian uprising against the Italians. The French were thinking about intervening, so the Germans wanted to support the uprising against the Italians in order to convince the French to intervene, in order for the French to keep control eventually so that they have to block the British. I mean, this is the kind of soap opera steps that we're starting to get into. So you can see this gets fairly convoluted at a certain degree, and you can start losing track of the big picture when you get into the details of it. But the big picture is that the German leadership is trying to promote a war between Britain and France. Okay, so that's still clear? Alrighty. And again, back to the European map, because Germany is trying to convince Britain to fight against France so that Britain joins Germany, and then Germany and Britain can basically rule Europe for as long as they want. So, Abyssinia is off in this area east of the Nile River, but not right up on the exact coastline of the Indian Ocean. And the British start marching south. In the early 1890s, they start marching south from their colony in Egypt. They build up an army there to invade southward into Sudan and start taking strong points along the river. And the British theory continues to grow that in order to really control the river, we need this next piece. And then they get that and they say they want this next piece. And so they're literally kind of going along the river trying to build up forts and take strong points. They conquer the area around Dongola and continue moving south. Eventually they get to an area around Khartoum. The British have to fight off a native resistance movement that was even in Abyssinia out here to the east, called the Mahdi Resistance. They had even fought against the Italians and the French, so this was a native uprising that literally wanted to kick the Europeans out and have their own government back. So they fight against really any foreigner. They're an independence movement that gets melded in with some religious ideas. So a lot of those fighters are very willing to die for the cause because they think they're going to be rewarded by God and whatnot. So the British have to keep fighting against them, and they're fighting on many different fronts. They're mostly successful in Abyssinia for a while. In the 1880s are their biggest victories. But by the 1890s, the British are moving enough military force with enough firepower to defeat the resistance movement. Around Khartoum, they start moving even further south. And they eventually completely defeat the movement's leaders by 1898. So this is still going forward. So they control Khartoum by 1898, where the two major branches of the river meet, and they think that's a good strong point. But they continue marching south even more. And under the General Kirchner, they continue marching south, and they literally, without knowing it at first, run into a French army at a place called Fashoda. And this is where it looks like the German policy is going to be successful. Literally, a British army has run right into a French army at this place. And it looks like they're going to fight it out to see who is going to retain control over the whole area. And again, the German leadership is just absolutely drooling at the idea. And what do you think happens?
They fight.
No, they did not fight. These two leaders were smart enough. The British general and the French general realized that it was not in their national interest to fight each other. So instead of starting a war by themselves, they sent messages back to Paris and London asking for instructions. And very quickly the leaders in Paris and London start talking to each other, and they come up with a basic treaty system. Whereas, basically, the French will evacuate the area. They will move far west of the Nile River. They will largely give up a lot of their colonies in the eastern part. They strike a deal with the native Abyssinians to stay away from the Nile River in return for some amount of quasi-independence, at least the best they could really hope to get in those circumstances. And they even forced the Belgians to evacuate kind of eastern Congo away from the river system. So the French at this point largely gave in to British demands because the French were desperate to not piss off the British. The French leaders understood that if war broke out in Europe, that they will need the British on their side. So the French take the stance that fighting over this area against the British is going to be like shooting yourself in the foot. You're going to do more harm for the relations with the British than they will ever gain by possibly just retaining the territory that they're going to fight over. Just decided that the territory wasn't worth the risk of losing a European war to a British and French or British and German alliance. So the British understand their negotiating position and they drive some hard negotiations, and they get virtually everything they want. So for a long time, the British will dominate not just Egypt, but far down into Sudan along the Nile River and down into Central Africa. Question?
Yeah, did the French and the British ever realize what Germany was doing to them, like to try to play each other out?
Yeah, it's not easy for the Germans to hide that they're doing this.
Yeah.
Because it's You guys ever seen a movie called Munich? A Spielberg movie? Where there's all these different groups of assassins, basically. And there's one group that doesn't really kill anybody, but they sell the information for where the assassins' targets are. Does that make sense? And this group is selling names to all these different assassin groups. And the leader of the group selling the names has a line in the movie where he says, "My life continues or ends at the possible intersections where all these different assassin groups start talking to each other." Because once they do, they're going to realize I'm stabbing them all in the back and taking everybody's money. They're going to come after me. So that was the position that the Germans were in. You can get away with it as long as they don't start discussing it amongst each other. Or say if you think you're really cool and you have like 4 different girlfriends. You can get away with it maybe as long as they don't run into each other. And then it's death, right? Or suicide at least. Does that make sense? Or if you have 4 different boyfriends, I'm not going to say. People play this game on all sides. So, yeah. And it's the basic kind of fact of life when you try to get away with something. What's the saying for this? Something about spinning bigger webs or something like this? You ever hear this? I can't remember it. Yeah. Practicing to deceive. I can't remember. But yeah, it's a major problem for German foreign policy. But at this point, especially by the late 1800s, late 1890s, Bismarck is out. He's been kicked out of the German government, forced into retirement, and this king and his advisors running German foreign policy is just a disaster. He is an unmitigated, complete disaster. He is short-sighted. He is not quiet, and he very much believed, apparently, that Germany could really never lose in this stuff. Whenever you study his policy, it's would be embarrassing if I was German. Which I partly am, but I have those kinds of allegiances. So when you look at the map of Africa, by the end of the 1800s, around the year 1900 or so, Britain is dominant in the most valuable areas, which are largely Egypt and the whole Nile River system, because most of the rest of northern Africa is dominated by the giant Sahara Desert, which is virtually uninhabitable. So the French will carve out some colonies along the very northern coast that's closest to Europe. And some other groups will carve out some valuable kind of mineral colonies, like places for ivory or gold or something like that. But the British are dominant over the largest populations in what is seen as the largest kind of possible economy for all of northern Africa. Other questions about any of this? Nope. Okay. All right, now going to the southern half of Africa. We'll try to get through this also fairly quickly, but it's even more complex, convoluted. The Europeans had been obviously, ever since we started the semester with Bartolomé Dias, the Portuguese had been first to discover where the southernmost point of the African continent is, go around it, get to India and kind of other places in South and Southeast Asia. So the Portuguese were the first in, let's see, 1580s, yeah, no, 1480s, 1480s. So the Portuguese did it first, and the Portuguese realized fairly quickly that if you're going to continue making these voyages, that would be good to establish a series of colonies because it takes a long time to get there. So you have to have basically the kind of gas stations along the way, right? You have to have a place to rest and refuel and take on fresh water, take on enough food to make it to the next leg of the journey and get to the next resting point. And the colony they established in the very southern tip that they will call Cape Sound, because it's the Cape of Africa, becomes one of the most valuable colonies in this string. Let's see. Okay. The Portuguese dominated that trade route for a little while, but Portugal didn't have the military power to really keep full control over all these areas. Other European trading powers, especially the Dutch Republic, come in 1650s and largely take over the colony and rename it, or kind of recursion it, Cape Colony. And the Dutch really run it as their own national colony. So the Dutch come and take control. And when the Dutch took control, they didn't just have a small-scale city that the Portuguese had kind of left behind. The Dutch start immigrating there. So native Dutch people start leaving Europe and going down to this very southern tip of African colony because there's so much money to be made. Trading stuff from one part of the world to another was a huge business. Families could become very, very wealthy very quickly. So a lot of Dutch people start going there. They start occupying more and more land around the colony. And after a few generations, interestingly, they start referring to themselves as native Africans, figuring that they were the first in this area. Were they the first people living in this area? Of course not. There are real native Africans living in the area. Why do you think the Dutch start thinking of themselves as the native Africans and just ignoring these actual people that had been there for a long, long time?
Social Darwinism?
That's part of it. Not so much a Darwinism kind of evolution fight for survival yet, because that theory hasn't come out for a couple hundred years.
Nationalism?
Nationalism, and the fact they looked down on these native peoples, the real native peoples. They looked at the African peoples as being backward, barbarous, but also defined them as economically undeveloped. The Africans do not take land and divide it up according to private property. So when they build towns or cities or something, it's not like each family gets their 1 acre or whatever of land. They do not have a free land market where they can buy and sell private property, because they largely don't have divisions of land in that kind of European way. So when the Dutch start to arrive, they see that these African peoples haven't really divided up the land, and they seem to be kind of raising things more communally, and that confused the Dutch because they're used to the European land market where you can take money and buy pieces of property of fairly large size. So the Dutch go in and they basically argue that the real native Africans were just not using the land properly, and therefore could be moved out or enslaved. So the Dutch start doing that in very large amounts, either moving the real natives around or enslaving them. And a lot of these Dutch start calling themselves native Africans, and their term for that is Boer. So this is where they stop actually calling themselves Dutch, and they refer to themselves as Boers, which is a interesting thing. Has this happened anywhere else in human history?
I was going to say it sounds a lot like America and the Native Americans.
Yeah, when the Europeans arrived in the Americas, they looked at the natives living what they thought of as a backward, savage, kind of animalistic lifestyle, and were convinced that these people were wasting the land because they weren't dividing it up and putting it up for sale and all that kind of stuff. So it's the exact same kind of circumstance, with very similar tragic results for the real native people living in the area. Which, according to recent South Park's argument, is still going on. If you saw that one, I laughed until I thought I was internally bleeding. You guys see the Hawaiian one? The native Hawaiian one? Oh man, you got to look that one up somewhere. It is beautiful. But this tends to happen when people tend to think that they're so much superior to others. It gives them an excuse to take valuable things and take valuable people. Another problem, or an emergent problem for the Boers, is that the British took over the Boer colony. They took it from the Dutch at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1814, 1815. And that was one of the big things in the peace treaty that the British demanded. So the British in 1815 are taking even more colonies than they had before, and the British expand their empire. And one of the colonies they took was this Cape Town colony that had been run by these so-called Boers for a century and a half by that point. This very much angered a whole lot of the Boers because the British had outlawed slavery in their empire during the Napoleonic Wars. So now that the British come in, it is now a British colony, therefore slavery is illegal. Outlawing it in the empire in 1807 means that the British outlaw slavery in their empire, but not in the home country. Slavery is still legal in Britain itself. They don't get rid of that one until a few decades later. But Britain becomes one of the earlier European powers to outlaw slavery in all of their vast holdings. French had done it first during the French Revolution, proclaiming liberty and equality and whatnot, got rid of slavery. But the British followed suit fairly quickly. And when slavery is outlawed, this angers so many of the Boers that they basically decide to get up and leave. They don't want to be in this British colony anymore, so they literally, in massive numbers, pick up whatever valuables they can carry, and they walk out of the British colony, and they walk into the kind of valleys to the northeast, and they kick the natives out of those areas or enslave those peoples, and set up new Boer colonies. So this is known in many textbooks as the Great Trek of the Boers out of the British colony to go off and set up new Boer colonies. There are two different colonies that emerge. It's fairly controversial. The British are very offended that the Boers have done this, especially that they're going off into these new areas and enslaving other African peoples. So the British will fight a war against the Boers fairly early on to try to get them to stop. That doesn't really work. But eventually, two new Boer colonies rise. One is called the Orange Free State, and the other is called the South African Republic. So the Orange Free State is the lower one. The one up in the Transvaal, which was a name that it's a Germanish sounding name, so it comes out of Dutch culture. So you get the establishment of these two what they say are basically new countries, but they're basically European-style colonies again. And the Boers seem fairly happy with that. The British don't really mind because, the problem has left their area. The problem reemerges, though, when valuable minerals are discovered in some of those Boer holdings. And at this point, the British decide that they want to take them. So first, in the orange side, the southern one, diamonds are discovered about 10 years after the establishment of the place. The British and the Boers fight a war, a fairly short-lived war, where the British get some of the land, but largely these two so-called independent countries survive. The Orange Free State, pretty large chunks of it are kind of taken into the British colony. But the Transvaal remains much more independent than the Orange Free State, but it's getting into the kind of details that you don't have to know all that much about. Yeah.
Who kept the diamonds?
Largely the Boers, but the leaders of, especially the economic elites of the British colony, start trying to sign contracts with the Boers to allow British companies in to mine them. Of course, take a cut of it for themselves. So that's ongoing. That kind of dispute is ongoing. And that leads to the next major development. So any questions about any of this so far? I mean, it's the same old story of greedy, underhanded kinds of politics. And, when trying to convince people politically to do what you want doesn't work, go in with guns and try to force them to do it. So this leads to the next guy. Cecil Rhodes is a politician who goes from Britain to this Cape Colony, and he is in control of one of the largest diamond companies in the world. And he goes into the colony in order to convince its government to do certain things. Number one, Rhodes was concerned that these, he defined them as like Germanish kinds of people, which was really insulting to them. And he was afraid that they would form alliances with German colonies kind of on the other side over here on Western Africa, and that they'd form a lineup of colonies, German/Dutch type colonies, that would cut the British colony off from other British colonies coming all the way south from Egypt. So this guy Rhodes starts making contact with the colonial government at Cape Town. And he is appointed a kind of foreign diplomat, basically, for the colony. And he starts going out and signing a whole lot of deals with a lot of native, like real native African tribes on the periphery of the Boer areas. And he signs so many different deals that he signs alliances between those native African groups and the Cape Colony and Cape Town. To the point where eventually these different African groups and these lands are brought together into one new colony that becomes known as Rhodesia, named after Rhodes himself, because it seemed to be a kind of political coup, kind of great political move that no one thought imaginable that he pulled off. And he also tried negotiating with a lot of native groups on the coastline side of those Boer colonies to try to get them to unite, basically surround the Dutch, or the Boers, and force them to give in to British demands. He keeps signing deals, but that doesn't work. He is so popular amongst many politicians in Cape Colony that they actually make him prime minister of the colony. So he becomes the head government figure of the colony. And his program is to create a railroad system that would go from the very southern tip of Africa all the way up through Rhodesia and connect to the southern holdings of the British northern half of the colonies and connect a railroad that he dreamed would go all the way from the Mediterranean coastline in Egypt and travel all the way down south to the very southern tip at the Cape Colony, at what's becoming known as Cape Town. And of course, he doesn't just want to build the railroad for nothing. He wants to link British military power, and because he's still one of the heads of this giant diamond company, he wants to make a lot of money off this. And he nearly accomplishes a lot of this stuff. One of his major things he wanted to do to accomplish it was to basically wipe out the Boer colonies. He viewed them as the greatest threat to this big kind of system. So he goes through a lot of really underhanded, secret kinds of things to try to start a war against the Boer colonies. There are rumors that he's trying to start riots within the Boer colonies. He's trying to get British citizens in the Boer colonies to start doing very illegal things to get them arrested so that they would write letters to the Cape Town government asking them to be liberated. I mean, it's really some underhanded stuff. And he is eventually, in the 1890s, kicked out of the prime minister position when a lot of stuff is made public, so he's removed from government. But at this point, gold is also known to be found in the Transvaal, so that's another big motivation for the British to go in and try to take over this place. And for years, Rhodes is trying to provoke a war against especially the Transvaal region, that Boer group, in order to conquer them and make them part of this gigantic British colonial system. But eventually he's found out and he is forced to resign. He's kicked out of office basically, so he goes off in a fair amount of shame. But the war goes anyway. And the war starts in 1899. So eventually you get basically a war of the British against the Boers, and this is known in textbooks as the Boer War. And at first the Boers were fairly successful in fighting. They were defending what they viewed as their own territory. And in a lot of their minds, of course, their ancient homeland, which, is a little bit out there, but that's what they thought. So they're fairly successful. The war breaks out, and I believe it's December 1899, so at the very end of the year. And the Boers actually win several of the first battles until a gigantic British military shows up in the spring of 1900. And they pour into Cape Town, hugely resupplied, and they go forth and basically destroy the Boer armies mercilessly in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Was this around the time they were fighting France too, with coming down the Nile?
This is just a couple years afterward. Yeah. But yeah, one of the problems of this mass movement toward colonization is, war can break out at any place, at any time. I mean, one of the problems of running an empire is you have to keep a lot of different peoples oppressed. So there can be flare-ups all over the place, and sometimes they happen at the same time. That's one of the thing that turn the imperialist hair white. Literally, they're always worried and they're always moving troops around and stuff like that because you never know when this is going to happen. So a lot of European historians argue that this is one of the first kind of mechanized wars that the Europeans fight in a small scale. So this starts to reveal the power of industrial warfare. The quick reloading guns, the very much larger cannon that were used, and people died in mass numbers. And this is also one of the first times where armies go in and take populations entirely prisoner and start trying to separate populations from the fighting forces, right? Because a lot of times this turns into an insurgency. When the Boer armies lose on the battlefield, they turn to guerrilla tactics, which means hide, do hit-and-run type tactics. So they would often try to hide within the civilian population, and one of the ways that the British tried to separate them was to take the civilian population and put them into camps that became known as concentration camps, not the death camps that later Nazis will use. These are literally just camps that are built to concentrate people together, to put them all together in one place so you can somewhat easily control them. These are not murder camps. But of course they're prisoners, so it's not the best treatment, not the best provisioned or healthiest place around. So it's still a pretty miserable place to be. When the war ends, eventually the guerrilla Boer fighters give up by 1902, by about spring 1902, and the British fully subsume the Boer colonies into a British system of colonies. The Boers in some of their areas retain some amount of voting rights, so they can elect largely a Boer kind of local assembly to pass laws for themselves, but they owe their allegiance to the British Empire. So it's a strange little kind of instance. A lot of times they retain their political control with voting rights by completely denying the real native Africans any vote or any political voice or any political power at all. And this kind of racism and eventually separation of the races becomes normal. And this colony of South Africa that is eventually unified into one place, a lot of these laws become normalized within the South African colony in general. The separation of the races, what in the United States we call segregation, but in this area they call apartheid, which means keep the races apart. And that became very powerful, a powerful means of white control over larger real native populations. That continues even after South Africa is granted independence and becomes its own independent country. I believe it's 1961. So these kind of Boer inheritors that become the political leaders of South Africa, who speak with a European type of accent, but not really identifiable with Belgian or Dutch or even British anymore. It's a kind of menagerie of all these different languages. They keep power in South Africa for decades, for about 30 years, by literally enforcing apartheid, and it becomes extraordinarily brutal over time. But when you look at the map of Africa by about 1910 or so, at least after 1902 when this war ended, the British were the real winners in Africa, politically and militarily, because they lined up the most valuable colonies. They never got their full kind of railroad built that would go all the way from Egypt all the way down to South Africa. It was too difficult to maintain all of that land and control it. But the British largely controlled the most valuable areas and the largest populations. So the British came out eventually through their diplomacy and warfare to be the major rulers over Africa over time. One of the major problems, especially with African colonization, is that it eventually is not worth the cost of maintaining those places and keeping armies in the field and whatnot. Economically, these large populations are expensive to keep oppressed. You have to pay a lot of soldiers to be there. And one of the theories was that if you take colonies and you build up cities and whatnot and you turn them into farming communities, much like the British tried in the 13 American colonies, the British made a lot of money off that in the 1700s. They don't make nearly as much and they basically just break even. British taxation and British companies don't make nearly as much money in the African colonies as they did in other worldwide colonies that they had held. Largely because they build these cities and they try to turn African farmers into basically European-style farmers, where they'll grow food for the European markets, and food that a lot of African peoples just had never really tried to grow before very successfully. And they grow them in such quantities that they oversupply the market. Supply and demand kicks in. If something's oversupplied, the price is going to drop. So a lot of these native groups, even that go into European-style farming, just never make enough money off of selling their crops to buy a lot of European goods in return. So these colonies just are not nearly as profitable for especially the British, but other European groups going forward. The one thing, though, that is a big boon to the European economy is that they just suck huge amounts of resources out of Africa, and they throw them into the European factory system. And the European industrial power just grows and grows and grows because they have access to more and more resources. And it ends up being the Europeans who exploit African resources, not the African peoples. And that's largely one of the sources of African poverty and oppression in a lot of ways, still right down to today. But we'll get to decolonization later on. So questions about any of this? Nope. Okay. We'll take